Ours is an age of criticism, to which everything must be subjected. The sacredness of religion and the authority of legislation are by many regarded as grounds for exemption from the examination by this tribunal. But if they are exempted, and cannot lay claim to sincere respect, which reason accords only to that which has stood the test of free and public examination. Immanuel Kant. Today is going to be another short one, since it was the second half of last week's episode. So I'd like to discuss more about science, but in a different way. It's more philosophical, but the effects have a huge impact on society and ethics. I want to ask the question, is there such a thing as free will? First, follow me here. Within the church, there was one split with a group called the Calvinists, believing that everything is predetermined. You will either go to heaven or hell, and you have no control over which one you go to, because it has already been decided. Like with Schrodinger's cat, you don't know if the cat is dead or alive, so it's both alive and dead. Likewise, the Calvinist might say that God knows what will happen to you. God knows that you are alive or dead, so your state of being has, in a way, already been decided. Here's Laplace in 1814 in regard to Laplace's demon. We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion, and all positions of all items of which nature is composed. If this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analyses, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. The philosopher Immanuel Kant believed, and I quote, "Causality in accordance with laws of nature is not the only one from which all the appearances of the world can be derived. It is also necessary to assume another causality through freedom in order to explain them." It's an interesting debate for within the church, but how does science feel about it, and how does psychology affect this? As a side note, I will avoid the topic of religion from now on in order to keep this idea as simple and scientific as possible. I also don't wish to add such a strong personal bias from myself or other people into this discussion. So to help clear up any confusion before we continue, let me also define what I mean by free will. Free will is the ability to make a choice by yourself without outside influence. Now, on the other hand, one of my favorite quotes explains the other side. "Nothing of me is original. I am the combined effort of everyone I've ever known." Chuck Palahniuk, the author of Fight Club. This is determinism. We are determined by factors that you can't control. In psychology, for example, they look at the impact of nature and nurture on us and which ones have the biggest impacts on who we are as a person. The question I wanted to ask is there a third option beyond genetics and outside forces, such as your parents raising you while you're growing up? When looking into it, I found a master's thesis covering this very topic. It's more about genetic determinism instead of free will, but it raises some interesting points. I'll link it below if you're interested. Now, before we touch upon that thesis at all, I want to ask you something. Please raise your hand. Okay. Did you do it? I did the same test with my mother. She raised her hand, so was that her choice? To be honest, I'm not so sure. She did so because I asked her. She could have chosen to not raise her hand, though. However, she gave the reason that she's a people pleaser. It also helps that I'm her son. That choice was basically determined beforehand. I knew she would raise her hand because that's the type of person she is. If for you didn't raise your hand, you had a reason not to. Maybe you don't trust these tests because you've seen other tests that have weird tricks behind them. There was a reason at least that you didn't do it. Either way, you made a decision. The reason for your decision, it may often be related to your personality, and that personality was developed from experiences you had in your life, or it's genetic. You can't control either of those situations, so this begs the question, what about consciousness? If you take the determinism point of view, you then realize that you are controlled by thoughts and ideas that were made due to outside forces. If there were any change in your upbringing or genes, for example, you wouldn't be who you are now, nor thinking the same types of thoughts. You probably wouldn't have even clicked on this video. The same is in Newtonian physics. Each event has a cause. Each cause has a different cause before that. So it's honestly a pretty depressing thought for a lot of people, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense to me. Even your skepticism when hearing this is caused by multiple factors, and none of which are unique to you. You likely learn to think deeply about these things after being burned by others, taught well by your parents, anything like that. Choice is an illusion that's governed by the morals or things you have learned over the years. So that brings us to one interesting question. What about chaos? Can't random things happen? The thesis I read defines chaos as a finite number of outcomes from one decision. There are multiple possibilities, like when you roll a dice. There are 6 possible outcomes, but you can't determine what they will be until after they happen. So, does that mean that having multiple choices, multiple outcomes, is that free will? I would debate that in the case of the die here, the way it's thrown will partially determine the outcome. It's caused maybe by the strength of your arms, the way you hold the die, and the way it hits the table. Those are also not exactly random. However, one interesting point in the thesis, it says, a chaotic system is deterministic. I'll repeat that. A chaotic system is deterministic. If you look up chaos theory even, one of the definitions says that it's based on deterministic systems and the outcome only seems random. It's because the die, for example, is limited to 6 possibilities. That number has already been determined. Even stem cells, for example, you might think of, they have a limited number of uses. They can't transform into all types of cells. The situation they are in will then determine what they become too, unless acted upon for another reason. Even if they transform into something unexpected, there's going to be a reason for that happening. So, basically, every choice or every outcome still has some reason before it. This brings us to an idea that is quite difficult to imagine, but absolute chaos. That, of course, can exist in the quantum state of things. However, I am not at all knowledgeable about that in order to make a decision or give examples of this. You'll have to talk to a real physicist. On the surface, though, I would then argue if something is absolutely chaotic, if it's truly random, there is no choice there. There's no free will in chaos. It's not a choice. However, it would mean that not everything we know is 100% determined either. There is more to the universe than just choice. So, what does that mean for ethics? What would happen to medicine or the prison system if everybody agreed that there's no free will? The prison system, I think, is probably the best example I can imagine, because it is founded on the notion that every person has free will. If a person was already determined to commit a crime because of outside forces, then you couldn't punish that person. You could say that person chose to steal money. Well, why? Their neighborhood could be bad. Their family member could be sick. They still had a reason that was dictated by some other outside force. So you might then ask, people are inherently good? No, not necessarily. I'm saying that if someone is inherently evil, that was then determined by nature instead of nurture. The thesis states studies looking at the levels of expression of monoamine oxidase, MAOA, have found correlations between low levels of the protein and a higher incidence of antisocial behavior. Things like conduct disorders, antisocial personality symptoms, and violent offending. At the very least, this is a very good argument for rehabilitation programs instead of just locking people up. You can then create a quote-unquote nurturing environment for them in order to rewire parts of their brains to more quote-unquote acceptable behavior. Our idea of ethics would completely change, but maybe not for the better. If this idea is taken in the wrong way, people may imagine that if they do something bad, they may blame all outside forces. They may say, in a podcast, this guy said we don't have free will, so if I hurt someone, it's not my fault. By just telling you that free will doesn't exist, may be one outside force that leads to more crimes being committed. Laws could be created, for example, that then hurt people, well, more than they already do. There could be changes to laws regarding freedom, for example. Then more people will be oppressed. If there is no choice, then why even have a law that supports people's freedom? That's one way determinism can be detrimental to society. However, that would then get into fatalism and nihilism, which I would call too pessimistic, but in today's world, some people might say it is realism. For me, though, would I say that the future and anything bad that will happen is inevitable? That's still to be decided. So that's it. Thanks for listening and joining me today. Most people are likely to fight against this idea. They tend to want to have free will, to think of themselves as individuals, to think of themselves as special and unique. But I would then argue that you're only that way because of your genetics and the others around you. I just hope that you listen to this with an open mind, and maybe I even convinced you. If not, leave your ideas below. Let's keep it a healthy discussion, please, in the comments, but I'd enjoy hearing some counter-arguments, especially from the scientific community if you have any. Just remember, we're here, and we're listening.